Thanksgiving always felt like someone else's holiday. I'm Tyler, 28, and every year I slipped into my uncle's house like an extra chair at the table, never hated, just tolerated. My sister, Chloe, 32, was mom's carbon copy. Perfect grades, flawless hair, and now a doctor engaged to a neurosurgeon. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, the painter, the dreamer, who, according to Uncle David, never learned to grow up. Uncle David is that sitcom dad type, loud, opinionated, grilling king master of guilt trips. He hosts Thanksgiving every year. I go because tradition feels safer than breaking it. This November, though, something felt off. No invite, no group text, not even a passive-aggressive, hope to see you soon from mom. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe they forgot. Maybe the email got buried. I closed my laptop, convinced myself it was nothing. Then I saw Chloe's Instagram story, the long farmhouse table turkey steaming on a platter, everyone laughing, everyone except me. I stared at the image, heart tight. Have you ever been the one standing outside looking in? Let me know in the comments. Still, I drove the 20 minutes to Uncle David's, ready to laugh it off if I was wrong. When I pulled into the driveway, the cold air felt warmer than his welcome. Before I even shut off the engine, he appeared, arms crossed, chest puffed, grin like he'd won. "Not invited, Tyler," he said casual, as if we were talking about the weather. "Go home." I didn't argue. Through the big windows, I saw my mom at the head of the table. Chloe, beside her, scrolling her phone. Even my best friend, Jake, 29. My college roommate raised a glass as if I'd RSVP'd months ago. Nobody looked toward me. Nobody cared I was standing there. I nodded once, climbed back in the car, and drove to a nearby gas station lot. I leaned my forehead on the wheel, let the silence swallow me. Ever felt that hollow ache, tell me. Then I called Tara. She runs a popular social media page that this week is featuring holiday nightmares. I told her everything, no names, just the raw truth. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. First Jake, then Chloe. Mom. Missed calls and texts flooded in. My story had gone up anonymously and had already gone viral. I sat there stunned. For the first time, I wasn't the background character, and yet something new was brewing, something that would change everything. I woke up before dawn, the weight of last night's conversation with Emily pressing against my chest like a too-tight sweater. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how for years I'd swallowed the coldness of my family like bitter medicine, forcing myself to believe it was for my own good. Eventually, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to say something. Pushing myself up, I shuffled to my makeshift art studio in the corner of my apartment, an old closet repurposed with string lights, empty canvases, and paint-splattered tarps. I'd always hidden in here when life felt too loud, letting colors speak what words couldn't. This morning, I dipped my brush into a shallow pool of cobalt blue and made the first daring stroke across a blank canvas. Each line felt like a heartbeat, a defiant pulse, affirming that I existed and that my story mattered. As I painted, memories flickered in my mind, my mother's dismissive glance when I handed her holiday cards. Chloe's triumphant smile whenever she snagged the last slice of pie, Jake's polite nod before he followed the crowd inside. The canvas grew more chaotic, swirls of anger, streaks of heartbreak. But underneath it all, a thin ribbon of gold paint emerged, threading through the chaos like a promise I could turn pain into beauty. My hands trembled as I added the final touches, letting the paint drip into puddles on the tarp. When I stepped back, I saw more than just disorder. I saw resilience. Yet as the morning light peeked through my dusty window, I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. What would I do with this truth now that it was alive on canvas? Later that day, I met Emily at a cramped corner cafe that smelled of burnt espresso and hope. She arrived wearing her late mother's scarf, emerald green silk that fluttered around her neck like a banner. We sat, pressed against a fogged-up window, nursing lattes that went cold faster than our conversation heated up. She told me about the way Uncle David manipulated family lore, how he whispered half-truths at gatherings to keep everyone off balance, always casting me as the son who'd chosen art over ambition. I shared how Dad's sister once cornered me at a reunion, tears in her eyes, saying she'd always believed Uncle David's version of me. Around us, strangers chatted about traffic and local politics, oblivious to our exchange of family secrets. It felt surreal to expose decades of discord over chipped ceramic mugs and chipped-away trust. Emily leaned forward, voice low, and said, "If we publish the documents," I dug up old voicemails, emails, "even that video from your graduation dinner, it will shatter their narrative." I took a sip of my cold drink, feeling its sweetness cut through the bitterness in my chest. A part of me trembled at the thought of unleashing all that evidence of watching my family reel from their own history. But another part of me whispered that silence had already cost me too much. I looked at Emily's determined face and realized I was on the edge of something irrevocable, one click away from burning the bridge to my past. Could I summon the courage to leap? Back in my apartment, I spread my phone and laptop across the kitchen table, a chaotic sprawl of screensavers and sticky notes. I opened the folder Emily had sent voicemail clips of Uncle David berating his first wife emails with my name in the subject line, calling me soft and unworthy, a shaky video of him minimizing my degree in front of the family. Each file felt like a brick removed from the wall they'd built around me. I listened to the messages on repeat, watching my own clipped silence echo through the audio, and realized how deeply I'd internalized their gaslighting. My reflection flickered in the laptop screen, my face half hidden by the glow of the monitor. It struck me that I could either keep assembling these pieces for my eyes only, or I could publish them on a new platform, an anonymous blog, a digital gallery where truth would stand under its own light. My palms sweated as I hovered over the publish button. I thought of the lawsuits they could threaten, the lawyers they might hire, the social backlash I might face. Yet the idea of burying the evidence felt like a betrayal of my own voice. With a trembling thumb, I tapped post, watching the timestamp appear beside the headline, "Family Canvas, How Silence Became Our Scars." My heart pounded, and then almost instantly notifications pinged across my phone. Comments began to trickle in, strangers validating my story, offering solidarity. I exhaled, half relieved and half dreadful, knowing that once the truth was out, it could never be contained. Was I ready for the fallout? Within hours, the blog post spread beyond my little corner of the internet. I saw screenshots on Twitter, shares on Instagram stories with captions like, "We need to talk about family abuse," and messages from people who claimed they recognized my experience all too well. At first, it felt like a balm proof that my story resonated. But then an ominous direct message popped up from Aunt Carol. "You're breaking up the family over a silly misunderstanding. Remove it now, or we'll see you in court." I stared at the screen, the pixelated letters blurring as my pulse raced. Threatening legal action was classic Uncle David playbook: bully with silence, then bully with intimidation. I considered taking it down, reasoning that keeping the peace might be easier than fighting a lawsuit. But the golden ribbon I'd painted that morning, the one symbolizing resilience, flared inside me. I forwarded the DM to Emily, who replied, "They're scared because they know it's true. Don't back down." My fingers hovered over the reply field, my breath shallow. I could feel the walls closing in, but I also felt a fierce heat coursing through my veins. For the first time, the idea of standing firm didn't scare me. It felt like the only path left. How far was I willing to go to keep my story alive? As the days passed, I leaned on my friends and on Emily's quiet strength. Tara helped me set up a secure email for tips and corroborating evidence. I hired a freelance web developer to ensure the blog couldn't be easily taken down. Meanwhile, I kept working on the painting, adding layers, scarlet red strokes cutting through the cobalt and gold. That canvas began to feel like a battlefield map, each color a territory claimed back from my family's erasure. My phone buzzed constantly. Journalists requesting interviews, legal advisors offering pro bono help, even a psychologist who wanted to feature me in a study on family trauma. I sifted through it all, careful to protect my anonymity while letting the world in just enough to hold my family accountable. One evening, I found myself pacing my living room, rehearsing what I'd say if Uncle David challenged me in court or on national television. The idea of standing face to face with him exposing his cruelty in public sent a shiver down my spine, but it also ignited a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. I realized that my fight was no longer just about one missed Thanksgiving dinner. It was about dismantling a multi-generational pattern of manipulation. I paused by the window looking out at the city lights and wondered, would my family ever see me and understand the picture I was painting? Fueled by a mix of adrenaline and resolve, I decided to reclaim Thanksgiving on my own terms. I sent out invitations to a small circle, Emily, Tara, Jake, and a few other friends who'd shared their own holiday betrayals. I booked a community art space downtown, the kind with exposed brick walls and high windows. I'd turn it into a Thanksgiving gallery, my painting as the centerpiece, surrounded by photographs and testimonies from people who'd suffered similar wounds. I called it Feast of Truth. Booking the venue felt momentous, like signing a treaty with myself that this year I would belong somewhere. Yet the risk was enormous. If word got back to my family, they could try to shut it down, claim defamation, or even show up and sabotage it. My heart fluttered every time I rehearsed the guest list in my head. But as I taped up flyers around the neighborhood, each one hand-lettered bleeding crimson ink, I felt a surge of ownership I'd never experienced at my uncle's perfectly polished dinner table. The act of creation and confrontation blended into one. I looked at my reflection in a window pane, two faces overlapping, one pained, one determined, and I knew I was stepping into uncharted territory. Would I find new family in the people who believed me, or would the ghosts of my past crash the party? On the morning of the event, I woke to a cascade of rain against the roof, as if the sky itself was washing away the old wounds. I stood in the empty gallery, paint cans lined up like soldiers and my canvas draped under a white cloth at the far end. Soft light filtered through the windows, and I imagined every glass pane as a lens into my story, offering clarity where there had only been shadows. Jake arrived first, followed by Tara with a thermos of coffee, and then Emily, her emerald scarf now tied like a warrior's banner. As they helped me set out mismatched chairs and bowls of homemade granola, I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, a mix of gratitude and raw anticipation. We hung black and white portraits snapped from my blog inbox, faces of strangers who'd sent in selfies holding notes that read, "I survived this too." A hush settled over the space, broken only by the gentle hum of conversation and the smell of rain outside. With a last deep breath, I stood beside the covered painting, looked at my friends' expectant faces, and felt the full force of what I was doing, transforming my pain into collective healing. My hands hovered over the cloth. What would happen once I unveiled the truth in plain sight? With a trembling smile, I pulled the cloth down, revealing the full canvas, the chaos of colors, the gold ribbon glowing defiantly at its center. A ripple of gasps and soft applause filled the room. I knew this moment would echo far beyond these brick walls. But as I opened my mouth to speak, my phone vibrated in my pocket, a notification that a local news site had just published an article headlined, "Artist's Thanksgiving Exhibit Exposes Family Abuse." I felt the room tilt, the stakes climbing higher than ever. On one hand, my story was out alive and breathing in public view. On the other, I was exposed vulnerable to every reaction, legal threats, media spin, maybe even remorse from my mother or rage from Uncle David. My heart thundered, but beneath it, a steady pulse of conviction. I had painted my truth, and now it was out there in full color. I closed my eyes, steadied my breath, and prepared to address the small crowd before me, knowing this was only the beginning of a reckoning I could no longer avoid. What words would I choose to guide them through my story and through the darkness I'd turned into light? I stood before the gathering as rain pattered against the high windows, the glow from my canvas washing the room in cobalt and crimson light. My heart hammered so loud I worried they could hear it, but somehow silence wrapped around me, giving my voice space to rise. This painting, I began, voice low and steady, is more than pigment on cloth. It's the map of my scars and my salvation. I told them about every slash of red anger, each stroke of gold hope. Faces blurred under the paint's shadow, my mother's hesitant comfort, Chloe's rehearsed smile, Uncle David's booming laugh that always came at my expense. As I spoke, I felt the walls of my own fear tremble, then crack until I wasn't just Tyler, 28, the guy who couldn't grow up. I was Tyler, the witness, the artist, the one who refused to vanish. Behind me, the crowd shifted, leaning in as if drawn by the truth I'd laid bare. When I finished, a hush held the room pregnant with possibility. Then a single clap echoed and another joined it until everyone was on their feet. But as the applause washed over me, a new question welled up. Could I turn this moment into real change, and what price would I pay to do it? Reporters hovered at the edges, pens poised over notepads, cameras trained like unblinking eyes. One woman with a badge that read City Arts Weekly approached, voice friendly but firm. Why show your wounds in public? Didn't you worry about retaliation? She asked. The lenses seemed to pin me to the spot, and for an instant I felt naked, exposed in the bright glare of scrutiny. But then I remembered the gold vein in my painting, how it threaded through every scar and turned pain into promise. Because silence is the agent of abuse. I said, quiet but unyielding. If my story can loosen the chokehold of shame on even one person, it's worth the risk. The flash of bulbs captured my reflection, half angel, half avenger. And I realized that by stepping into the light, I'd risked everything: my privacy, my relationships, my sense of safety. As the reporter scribbled furiously, I wondered how far her words would travel and whether I'd live to see their echo. That evening, a message popped up on my phone from a number I didn't recognize. It's me, Aunt Marisol. My breath caught Mother's youngest sister, the one who left home at 18 and vanished. She wrote she'd been following the blog that she'd kept evidence of Uncle David manipulating family wills letters where he'd planned to cut me out too. She wanted to meet somewhere public, hand over the documents. My pulse raced. Was this a trap? Could I trust Marisol, given everything I'd learned about deception in my own blood? Yet a spark of hope ignited another branch of my family tree, reaching out, offering fresh fruit after years of rotten silence. I arranged to meet her at a quiet diner near her apartment. As I slid into the booth, I felt that old knot of anxiety tighten, but also a strange excitement, like uncovering buried treasure. She placed an envelope on the table and slid it toward me without a word. My fingers trembled as I touched it. Could the truth she carried heal my wounds or rip them open wider? By midnight, I'd waded through Marisol's envelope, medical documents showing how Uncle David had funneled money from Mom's accounts, old videotapes of my childhood birthday parties where he'd edited out my laughter, letters from my grandmother begging him to stop. Each piece was a brick removed from the wall of lies. I contemplated releasing it all alongside my painting, full disclosure, no holds barred. But then my lawyer friend warned of defamation suits. Publishing private documents without consent could land me in court. The legal threat felt like iron chains around my ankles. My chest ached at the thought of trading one prison of silence for another of litigation. Yet I couldn't just tuck these truths away. I drafted a plan. I'd anonymize the documents, blur faces, redact names, release them as the David files, so the facts would speak without dragging individuals into the fray. As dawn broke, I sent the redacted dossier to my blog and watched the upload bar crawl toward completion. When it hit 100%, I felt the rush of liberation and the chill of uncertainty. Would the world see justice, or would my family drag me into a courtroom storm? In the days that followed, Uncle David's legal team went to work. I received a cease and desist letter so thick it felt like armor plating a demand to remove the files or face consequences. They accused me of violating privacy, defaming a public figure, and threatened injunctions. I held the letter in my hand, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the messy truth I'd bared. My phone rang with texts from Chloe imploring me to apologize. Mom's voicemail trembled as she begged me to give the family a chance to repair the damage. For the first time, the weight of expectation pressed on me. If I capitulated, I'd betray the strangers who'd drawn strength from my story. But if I stood firm, I'd ignite a family feud that could destroy everything. I stared at my painting. Its gold thread seemed to pulse, urging me to choose integrity over comfort. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, drafting a reply. No, I will not take it down. As I hit send, I heard my own voice in my head. This is where stories become legacies, but can I live with the fallout? Meanwhile, a package arrived from Mom, handwritten in a shaky scrawl. Inside was a vintage pocket watch, our family heirloom that had belonged to my grandfather, the sole symbol of unity they'd ever offered me. The crystal face was cracked, the hands frozen at 6:13. Underneath Mom's note read, "Time heals what we break." Tears stung my eyes. The watch was evidence of both love and neglect, a relic of promises shattered. I wound it gently, only to hear the gear whir and then grind to a halt. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Time itself had betrayed my family. I left the watch on my artist's table, letting the fatigue of betrayal sink in. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to sever the link to a past that had never held me. But another part recognized its value, proof that love, though broken, could be mended. As the afternoon sun shifted, casting long shadows across my studio floor, I wondered, could I repair what time had worn thin? And more importantly, should I even try? To reclaim my narrative, I organized a small panel discussion at the gallery Shadows of the Feast, featuring 3 others who'd been cut out of their families. In that hushed brick room, their stories poured out: a sister abandoned over inheritance, a son shamed for his sexuality, a mother exiled for speaking her truth. When it was my turn, I spoke not as the wounded boy, but as the architect of my own liberation. I described how silence had been sold to me as peace, only to imprison me in shame. The audience nodded in solidarity, and I sensed a shift: collective pain turning into collective power. Yet beneath the warmth of shared recognition, a tension crackled. Some in the crowd smiled politely, but a few eyed me as if I'd provoked too much trouble. One attendee, a family counselor, questioned whether airing private grief publicly was ethical. The room's energy split between empathy and skepticism, mirroring my own ambivalence. When the moderator raised his hand for closing remarks, I felt the room hold its breath. Could this fragile alliance withstand the heat of unfiltered truth? The local paper ran a front-page story: Artist Sparks Family Reckoning. The headline felt surreal: the seed I'd planted, now a garden of gossip. Strangers messaged me, sharing their own Thanksgiving betrayals, while others accused me online of tearing families apart. My inbox overflowed with encouragement and condemnation, 2 sides of the same coin. I realized the symbolism of my canvas had extended beyond art. It was a mirror, reflecting society's deepest conflict between loyalty and justice. At night, I'd wake to the glow of my phone screen, heart racing at every notification. I'd lie there listening to the hum of the city, wondering whether the judgment of strangers meant more than the love of my birth family. My mind flickered back to the silver pocket watch, still cracked, still stopped, resting on my desk like a silent judge. What if I'd gone too far? Had I traded the warmth of home for the cold glare of public opinion? And if so, what would I be left with when the dust settled? The rain returned in sheets, drumming on the pavement below my window. I found myself pacing the living room, replaying every conversation, every painting stroke. The walls seemed to close in, as if the gallery itself had followed me home. I knew I couldn't stay cooped up forever. I needed a plan to move forward. I opened my laptop and drafted an outline for a book, part memoir, part manifesto. I'd call it The Art of Saying No. It would be more than my story. It would be a guide for anyone trapped by expectations. As I typed the words, poured out how to recognize emotional manipulation, how to find your golden thread, how to build a new family of choice. My phone buzzed. Marisol wanted another meeting, this time with our grandmother in tow. The thought of facing the matriarch felt both terrifying and necessary. Could I confront the origin of these wounds, and would she even acknowledge her part in them? By dawn, the sky had cleared, revealing a pale sunrise that painted the city rooftops pink. I packed my bag, notebooks, pens, the cracked watch, the legal letter, and a small canvas of my own design, an abstract mix of red and gold symbolizing both rupture and redemption. I headed out to meet Grandma and Marisol at a quiet park bench, heart pounding with anticipation. As I neared their spot, I saw Grandma's white hair framed by the early light, Marisol's shoulders tense at her side. I realized this meeting could shatter the last fragile bonds or finally begin true repair. My throat tightened. Could I summon the compassion to bridge decades of betrayal? And was I prepared to face the woman who'd once protected me with lullabies but later stood silent while my voice? I found Grandma and Marisol seated on a weathered wooden bench beneath a lone oak tree, its branches laced with early morning mist. The air smelled of damp earth and promise, as if the sunrise itself was giving us a second chance. Grandma's white hair caught the pale light haloed by dew, and her hands trembled around a faded handkerchief. Marisol stood nearby, arms folded, an inscrutable look on her face that mirrored my own tension. I swallowed past the lump in my throat, felt each heartbeat hammering against my ribs like a call to arms. When I sat down, Grandma looked at me with eyes that were both sorrowful and relieved, as though she'd been waiting decades for this moment. Silence stretched between us, thick and tremoring, until I whispered, "Why now?" She drew a tremulous breath. "I lost the courage long ago, but your voice lit a fire I couldn't ignore." Marisol placed an envelope in my hand, another batch of documents, scribbled letters from Mom's youth, even a secret diary entry from my grandfather condemning Uncle David's cruelty. As I fingered the edges, I felt a surge of both hope and dread. Could I finally piece together the family I'd lost? Or would these papers ignite an inferno stronger than anything I'd imagined? Grandma's confession spilled into the dawn air like white flags unfurled. She told me how, after my grandfather died, Uncle David had wielded his inheritance as a weapon, threatening to cut her off unless she stayed silent about his misdeeds. Every time I started to speak, she said, voice cracking, he reminded me of the security I'd lose. A roof, an allowance, the last thread of comfort. Her admission hit me like a blow. All those times I thought she'd been cruel or indifferent, she'd been trapped by fear. For years, she'd watched me shrink into shadows, powerless to protect me. Marisol chimed in, revealing a twisted irony. Uncle David had bragged to her that he owned our loyalty, buying it with gifts and punishments. It was a bitter symbol of a warped family economy where love was transactional. As they spoke, I felt the foundations of my anger shift. This wasn't just about exclusion. It was about generations of bondage to silence and fear. I realized the real battle wasn't only with Uncle David, but with the legacy of complicity that had shackled us all. And with that realization, a new question emerged. Could we break these chains without destroying what remained of our family? I stood up, clutching the documents like talismans against the past. The oak's leaves rustled overhead as though the tree itself bore witness to our reckoning. "We need to show them this," I said, voice steadier than I felt. Marisol nodded, her eyes glinting with determination while Grandma dabbed at her tears. Together, we agreed to bring this evidence to Feast of Truth as an annex, an unfiltered chronicle of manipulation. But as I pocketed the papers, my phone buzzed with an ominous alert, a message from an unknown number warning me to drop the case or face consequences. My heart did a somersault. Threats were one thing when they came via lawyers. Direct intimidation was a whole new level of danger. The oak's shadow seemed to deepen, and I felt a cold spike of fear. But beneath it, I sensed the gold ribbon in my painting shimmering with resolve. If I let that fear dictate my next move, I would betray everything I'd built. Yet charging ahead risked legal action or worse. As I looked at Grandma's anxious face, I realized the decision was no longer just mine. Could I stand firm when push came to shove and drag my family into the fray? That afternoon, I transformed my studio into a fortress of creation and confrontation. Canvases leaned against every wall, bearing the scars and triumphs of my journey. I printed Marisol's documents, redacting names into initials and blurring faces to protect the innocent. Each page carried weight emails from Uncle David laced with threats voicemails of him calling me ungrateful and worthless. I stapled them to a large corkboard arranged like evidence in a detective's office. Overhead, a single spotlight cast dramatic shadows, turning the room into a stage for truth. Friends arrived to help Tara, hung strings of fairy lights for warmth. Jake set up a camera for a live-streamed reading, and Emily brought hot tea that steamed in porcelain mugs. As we finished, the studio felt less like an apartment and more like a sanctuary where silence had no place. But just as I was about to test the live stream, my phone rang. "This is Officer Ramirez. We have a trespassing complaint tied to your address. You need to clear out immediately." My breath hitched. A twist of logic struck me. Uncle David couldn't sue me directly without trial, but he could mobilize authority to harass me. The room's warmth chilled in an instant. My friends looked at me, their expressions a mix of fear and solidarity. I realized we'd reached a crossroads, bow to intimidation or broadcast our defiance live. Which path would claim us? I squared my shoulders and hit go live. The camera's red light glowed, and the world streamed in, strangers from across the country tuning in as I stood before the corkboard. Welcome to the annex of our Feast of Truth. I began, voice echoing in the hushed studio. I walked viewers through each piece of evidence, narrating Uncle David's tactics, how he'd manipulated wills, spread rumors, weaponized silence. Comments flooded in messages of outrage and solidarity. "Thank you for your courage," they typed. But no sooner had I finished when there was a loud knock on the front door, heavy, insistent. The friends I'd asked to stay safe huddled behind me as I muted the stream and peered through the peephole. A line of police officers stood outside, badges gleaming. Their leader spoke over the door. "You have a right to assembly, but we've had complaints about noise and obstruction. You must disperse." I took a shaky breath, then opened the door just enough to speak. "Officer, I am hosting an art installation, no disturbance. I'm not leaving." Behind me, my friends stood firm. The officers exchanged glances, their stance wavering. In that moment, I realized true power wasn't just in the law, it was in solidarity and visibility. Yet as I looked into their eyes, I felt the tension crackle. Would they enforce Uncle David's vendetta or respect my right to speak? The officers hesitated, then one finally said, "We're going to wait here for you to comply or be arrested." My mind raced. If I called Grandma and Marisol for backup, I risked dragging them into legal peril. But if I let the cops clear my studio, I'd lose the moment. I glanced at the corkboard evidence of decades of abuse, and then at the live chat comments urging me to stand my ground. With a steady voice, I turned back to the camera and resumed the feed. This is what happens when you break the silence: intimidation, threats, legal pressure. But look at all of you out there. We're not going anywhere. Viewers typed #Feast of Truth faster than I could read. The officers shifted awkwardly, their resolve cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. Finally, the lead officer lowered his notepad. "We're going to give you 1 hour to wrap up," he said. As they filed away, my knees went weak. I'd won this skirmish, but the war was far from over. The oak outside my window seemed to sigh, its branches still heavy with morning dew. I wondered, could my family's legacy of silence crumble under the spotlight I'd lit? Or would Uncle David's next move be the one that changes everything? By nightfall, the studio buzzed with nervous energy. The live stream had drawn thousands, the Feast of Truth hashtag trending locally. Journalists called for interviews, activists offered legal support, and strangers sent photos of their own stories begging to join the narrative. I stood amid the chaos, heart pounding, as Grandma and Marisol arrived to find the room filled with people I'd never met, but who believed in me as fiercely as blood. Their eyes held both pride and sorrow. Pride in my courage. Sorrow for the years lost. I realized the oak's leaves outside had darkened to black, the world outside tumbling into night. My gaze fell on the cracked pocket watch resting on the corner table, its hands still frozen at 6:13. A reminder that time could wound as deeply as any blow. Yet now the watch glowed under the spotlight, transformed into a relic of survival. I picked it up, feeling its weight, and pressed it into Grandma's hand. "We'll fix time," I told her. Softly, voice heavy with promise. She nodded, tears glistening. Around us, the crowd hummed with possibility. But as the final live stream segment blinked to an end, I sensed the tremor before the aftershock. Someone in the room was on the phone with Uncle David, telling him I hadn't backed down. My heart lurched, because the next move would decide whether our family's narrative stayed broken or found a way to heal. What choice will define us when the dust of this confrontation finally settles? I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing relentlessly on the bedside table, its screen glowing like an intruder in the pre-dawn darkness. The Feast of Truth event had ended hours ago, leaving me wired and raw. Yet when I saw the notifications, emails from my lawyer, a voicemail from the city clerk, texts from strangers urging me to keep pushing, I realized the battle had only just begun. Uncle David's legal salvo had arrived, a formal injunction motion demanding I remove all defamatory content within 48 hours or face contempt charges. My chest tightened as I reread the court's polite yet ominous language. "This is your final notice." I felt the weight of every lie he'd ever told pressing down on me, trying to crush my resolve. How could truth defend itself against power backed by money and influence? I closed my eyes and pictured the oak tree outside the gallery, its roots deep enough to hold century-old secrets. If it could stand firm through storms and droughts, maybe I could find that strength too. But as the sun crept over the horizon, I knew I had to decide, do I fight this legal war, risking everything I've built, my art, my fledgling community, or do I capitulate and let silence reclaim me? By mid-morning, I convened with my pro bono attorney Maxine in the cramped conference room of her downtown office. Legal books lined the walls like sentinels, and the hum of the city outside felt distant and detached. Maxine laid out our options: file a countersuit for emotional distress petition, for a declaratory judgment protecting free speech, or negotiate a settlement that would water down my narrative but avoid court. Each path had its thorns. Countersuing could drag me through months of discovery, exposing my personal emails. A declaratory judgment might stall David, but not end the threat. A settlement would leave me suspect, like I'd admitted partial guilt. I fought the urge to panic, to see every door as a trap. Instead, I asked questions. What precedent protected whistleblowers? Could I maintain anonymity while still defending my rights? Maxine nodded at my determination, yet her eyes held concern. "You'll need financial backing and public support," she warned. When I left her office, I felt both galvanized and petrified, aware that each choice carried the risk of humiliation, loss, or worse. Standing on the sidewalk, the morning light flickering off skyscraper windows, I realized that winning would demand more than legal strategy. It would demand every ounce of inner courage I could summon. As the legal papers piled up on my coffee-stained kitchen table, social media buzzed with new life. Family Canvas hashtags trended across platforms, and an unexpected message popped into my inbox, an invitation to speak at a national symposium on family trauma and the arts hosted by a prestigious cultural institute. The offer came with a standard stipend, travel arrangements, and an opportunity to exhibit my painting alongside academic panels. It was the kind of invitation most artists would dream of: a spotlight on my work, a chance to influence policy and perception. Yet I felt a pang of unease. Was I ready to share my grief on such a public stage? Would I become a spectacle, a case study rather than a person? The twist logic gnawed at me. The person who once hidden behind nightmarish silence was now courted by institutions hungry for authentic stories. Could my pain be commodified? I imagined the auditorium rows of seats filled with professionals nodding politely while scribbling notes. My heart thudded at the thought of reducing my family's wounds to bullet points in a PowerPoint. That night, I dreamt of my painting inflating to colossal size, eclipsing the sun, casting the world into the shadow of my scars. When I woke, I knew I had to choose: embrace the platform and risk diluting my truth, or retreat and let the narrative slip from my hands. Just as I wrestled with that decision, a text arrived from Chloe. "Can we talk? I'm free tomorrow." My thumb hovered over reply as I stared at her name, the weight of unspoken history pressing down. Chloe had been my sister, my golden sister, everyone's favorite, yet she had shown me nothing but cold shoulders since my post went live. Her text felt like a trap, a courtesy call before another round of blame. But beneath my cynicism, I sensed a tremor of longing. Had she finally questioned our upbringing? Or was she merely responding to David's demands for reconciliation to protect his reputation? I agreed to meet her at the corner cafe where we used to share milkshakes as kids. The next afternoon, I sat with her at a high-top table, the hum of espresso machines and jazz drifting around us. She looked older than her 36 years, shadows under her eyes. "I'm torn," she admitted, voice low. "I love you, but I've been terrified of him, of David. He convinced me you were ungrateful, that you wanted to embarrass us. But then I saw the live stream. I saw you standing your ground." Her confession uncovered a deeper twist. She'd been both victim and accomplice, swept along by fear and loyalty. I realized our conflict wasn't just about truth or lies. It was about the corrosive power of coercion in intimate relationships. As we talked, I felt the brittle bonds of sisterhood stretching, ready to snap or transform. Could we rebuild trust on this new ground, or would we fracture irreparably? That night, I found myself drawn to the old oak tree again, this time in the park where Grandma and I had met. The silhouette of its gnarled branches cut against the city lights, leaves whispering secrets in the breeze. I leaned my forehead against its rough bark, feeling its steady heartbeat, ancient, unjudging. The oak had witnessed family feuds, lovers' quarrels, promises made and broken. I closed my eyes and reflected on my own roots: a father absent, a mother silent, a sister complicit, and an uncle who treated love like a bargaining chip. I recalled the pocket watch in my studio, its hands stuck in time, a symbol of my family's unwillingness to change. Beneath that oak, I pulled the watch from my pocket. Its weight felt different in the night air, no longer a burden, but a token. I held it until the crack in its face caught the moonlight, fracturing the reflection of my own eyes. In that moment, I understood that time could only heal if we moved, if we dared to step beyond the fractures. I made a silent vow I would sow new roots, not the ones I'd inherited, but ones I'd chosen, nourished by truth and solidarity. Yet, as the wind rustled the leaves overhead, I felt a tremor of doubt. Change was a journey through uncharted terrain, and every step carried the risk of losing something irretrievable. Emboldened by that vow, I announced a new event. Breaking the Timepiece, a collaborative art installation and panel discussion inviting survivors of family manipulation to share their stories and artworks. I rented the community center's main hall, plain walls, tiled floors, intent on transforming it into a shrine of resilience. Flyers went up around town, bold, black and white, featuring the image of the cracked pocket watch at its center. I coordinated with local support groups, legal aid organizations, and mental health professionals to be on hand. The installation would feature my painting Marisol's redacted documents and interactive stations where visitors could write messages on paper watches, symbolically rewriting their own histories. It felt like reclaiming power to turn broken time into collective narrative. But the twist came when I received an anonymous package inside a series of blurred photographs of me as a child, taken without my consent at my university gallery show years ago, along with a note, "We can dig up anything. Back down now." My stomach lurched as I realized Uncle David had escalated beyond legal threats. He was mining my past to shame me. He'd weaponized my childhood-turned vulnerability into a liability. The vulnerability I'd thought I'd shed returned tenfold. Would I cancel the event to protect myself or stand by my vow to transform scars into solidarity? The day of breaking the timepiece arrived under a sky streaked with silver clouds. I stood in the empty hall, watching volunteers assemble displays, tape images to walls, and sketch out where chairs would go. The cracked watch motif appeared everywhere on the projection screen, printed on tote bags, even painted on the DJ's vinyl record slip mats for the evening reception. I checked the live stream feed one last time, ensuring tech was ready. My heart thrummed with anticipation and dread. At exactly 6, a group of attendees trickled in, survivors of estrangement activists, curious neighbors, and even a few faces from my blog comments. Each person carried a small paper watch, their eyes reflecting both pain and hope. As the room filled, I tapped the microphone and introduced the evening's purpose: to confront the tyranny of silence and rewrite our stories together. When I looked out over the crowd, lit by soft lanterns, I felt a surge of triumph. We had turned threats into a tapestry of resilience and fear into creative force. Yet as the first presenter stepped forward to share her painting, a swirl of midnight blue and red, I sensed a shadow at the back of the hall, a man in a dark coat, hooded, watching intently. I squinted, heart-catching. Could this be Uncle David in disguise, or someone else sent to intimidate? The moment stretched taut, and I realized that no matter how many allies I gathered, the specter of control would never fully leave me. How would I face the next challenge, knowing the war for my story was far from over? I arrived at the community center early, the morning light spilling through the tall windows and splashing across the paper watches tacked to the walls. My heart thrummed with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Today was the culmination of everything I'd risked and fought for. The installation had been painstaking. Desks draped in white cloth now held stacks of redacted documents, walls displayed paintings and photographs, and at the far end sat my canvas. Its cobalt chaos threaded with gold glowing like a beacon. Volunteers bustled around me, placing candles in jars, arranging chairs, and whispering last-minute instructions. Outside, a small crowd gathered, drawn by the promise of our breaking the timepiece evening. I felt every memory of silence, every bruise from old words echo in my chest, then shifted my gaze to the cracked pocket watch I carried in my hand, the same heirloom Grandma gave me, its hands still frozen at 6:13. In that pulse of hesitance, I reminded myself that time could only heal when we dared to confront the fractures. I tucked the watch into my pocket and squared my shoulders, steeling myself for the storm I'd summoned. What would happen once these doors opened? When the doors swung wide, a hush settled over the crowd as they stepped into the room. Faces new and familiar brushed past me. Survivors of estrangement, local activists, journalists, even the counselor who'd questioned my ethics at the panel discussion. I guided them toward the first station where they picked up blank paper watches and pens. "Right the moment you knew your silence cost you," the sign read. As people paused to fill in personal stories, I circulated among them, listening to fragments of heartbreak and defiance. I skipped my sister's wedding. I never spoke up about his drinking. I let fear silence me. Each confession felt like a gift, raw and luminous, and I stored them in a wooden box beneath the oak trunk sculpture I'd built for the occasion, its branches twisting overhead, sprouting paper leaves inscribed with hopes for the future. In that movement of vulnerability, I felt a power I'd never known, the collective ache of 1,000 stories, each shard held together by truth. The room hummed with a solemn energy until a sudden hush fell, and I sensed something shifting at the back, someone stepping into the light, hooded and deliberate, making their way down the center aisle. My breath caught as the figure approached the projection screen, its footsteps slow and assured. My mind raced through possibilities, another family member seeking to intimidate me, a journalist angling for a sensational scoop. But when the hood fell back, I saw Uncle David's face, tighter, more haunted than I'd ever seen it on Instagram or at a Thanksgiving dinner. The room stilled tension, coiling like a spring ready to snap. For a moment, I considered panic, calling for security, shutting down the event, but something in his gaze held me. His expression was unreadable. A swirl of anger, regret, and something almost remorse. I watched him stop before my canvas, his eyes tracing the gold thread that ran through the chaos. The crowd held its breath as if waiting for a verdict. My heart thundered. Was this the moment he'd come to destroy me, or the moment I'd finally force him to reckon with the truth he'd buried? Uncle David raised a trembling hand, pointing not at me, but at the evidence board behind me. "All of this," he said, voice cracking. "Is it all true?" His words echoed in the hall, ricocheting off the walls like pebbles in a hollow. The crowd shifted uneasily. I felt Grandma's gaze on me, an unspoken plea to handle this with care. I stepped forward, each footfall a declaration. "Yes," I answered softly but firmly. Every word, every document true. A collective intake of breath swept through the audience. Uncle David's shoulders slumped, and he let out a ragged sigh as if he'd been holding it in for decades. I thought I was protecting you," he stammered. "I thought silence kept us safe." His admission was both a blade and a balm, slicing through the lies while offering the possibility of reconciliation. I glanced at the oak sculpture, its paper leaves fluttering in the soft air, then back at him. The weight of power shifted. He who had wielded silence as a weapon now trembled under the weight of his own secrets. What if this confession was real, not another manipulation? Before I could respond, a murmur rose among the guests. Some moved closer in hope, others backed away in disbelief. Chloe stepped from the crowd, her face, pale eyes brimming with tears. She reached for my hand, trembling. "I didn't know," she whispered. I was scared too. Her words, fragile as they were created, a bridge between us two siblings rebuilt by shared trauma and defiance. Uncle David looked from Chloe to me, tears tracking down his cheeks. "I'm sorry," he choked out, "for everything." The rawness of that apology hung in the air, a delicate truth thread pulling at the scars beneath my skin. I felt the pull of empathy, the rush of victory, and the undercurrent of wariness. Could I trust it? Could I allow this man to step back into my life even as he crumbled before me? As the crowd held its breath, I realized the final test of courage wasn't in exposing him, but in deciding whether to let him return. That night, after the event wound down, I found myself alone in the gallery, the oak sculpture dimly lit by the candles we'd left burning. The papers lay scattered on tables, now empty of defamation threats, but heavy with confession and apology. I sat on the floor back against the canvas and reached into my pocket for the cracked pocket watch. Its hands remained frozen, but the gold thread in my painting, My golden hope glowed brighter in the candlelight. I thought of Grandma's trembling words, Chloe's tears, Uncle David's broken apology, and I understood that healing would be messy and unpredictable. It would require setting aside fear and rewriting the rules of our family allegiance. I tapped the watch's face gently as if willing it to move forward. Outside, the city lights blinked unjudging and alive. I closed my eyes and let myself believe that time could begin again, even for broken things. Yet, as I rose to leave, I felt a flicker of doubt. Could forgiveness ever be complete? Or was this just the beginning of a new kind of struggle? One where love and memory would forever wrestle in the daylight. The next morning, I woke to a raft of messages in my phone, journalists requesting follow-up interviews, community leaders praising the event, strangers sharing how they'd found the courage to speak. But the message that made me pause was from Mom. "Can we try again? I've read and cried, and I'm so sorry." My thumb hovered over the reply field. In the past, I would have typed a quick, "It's okay," hidden my hurt and let it slip from my memory. But now I knew the strength of my own voice and the price of silence. I crafted a reply instead. "I'm not okay yet, but I'm willing to try. Let's talk tomorrow." Sending those words felt like stepping onto another battlefield, armed not with painting brushes, but with vulnerability. I reached for the pocket watch, ran my finger over its crack, and felt a tiny shiver of hope. We could mend old wounds, but only if we were brave enough to face them together. As I set the watch on my windowsill and watched the sunrise ignite the city skyline, I asked myself, was I ready to let my family back into my heart, knowing that the clock might break again? By early afternoon, I met Mom at the same cafe where Chloe and I had reunited. She arrived with a folded letter in her hand, eyes red from crying. I gestured to the seat across from me, unsteady but resolute. She unfolded the letter, her voice small as she read, "I've learned that families can love you and still hurt you, but I want to be better. I want us to be better." Then she slid the letter toward me, a mirror of the one I'd received before, only hers was unwritten, a blank page. I asked what the empty lines meant. She closed her eyes and said, "I want you to tell me what's in your heart." My chest tightened at the risk of exposing myself again, but I had learned that authenticity was the only way forward. I took a deep breath, thinking of every tear, every brushstroke, every paper watch. I opened my mouth and let the truth spill out, every trembling confession of hurt and hope. Mom listened, her face shifting from guilt to understanding. When I finished, she reached across the table, her hand warm on mine. "Thank you," she whispered. The cafe's clatter returned around us, but in that moment, the world felt still. We sat in silence, not the oppressive, suffocating silence of before, but a resonant pause where two hearts met. And yet as I released my pent-up breath, I realized this was not an ending, but a passage, a doorway into a family that might never be perfect, but could now rebuild on a foundation of truth. The question at the threshold pulsed like a heartbeat. Would we have the courage to keep walking through it together? Story 2. I'm Sophie Rivera, 28. And I still remember the exact moment everything changed. It was my younger sister Erin's bridal shower at our childhood home, a pale yellow cottage with roses climbing the porch rail. 22 guests packed the living room, bridesmaids in blush yoga, classmates in crisp whites, a few cousins, my mother, and our Aunt Marisol, who'd flown in from Miami to film the family legacy. I held a navy folder in my shaking hand. Inside were the venue deposit receipt, a couture dress credit slip, and a check for $4,500. I'd spent weeks arranging every detail so Erin wouldn't worry about money. I thought it would be useful, practical. I didn't expect silence. Erin lifted her champagne glass. Her bridesmaid, Maya, Erin's oldest friend, gave me an uncertain smile. Erin's fiancé, Liam, lounged against the mantel, arms crossed, phone in hand. He eyebrow-browed at me like I was about to stage an intervention. I cleared my throat. Here, I slid the folder across a lace-covered table. I kept my voice low, just enough for her to hear. She flipped it open slowly. First the venue receipt, then the boutique confirmation, then the check. Erin's gaze flicked up at me. She blinked once, twice. Then she let out a slow, mocking laugh. Still trying to buy love, Sophie. The room froze. Someone clinked glasses. My mother, Elena, leaned in and whispered, "Don't be sensitive. It's just her humor." Humor. Erin's smirk cut deeper than any knife. I felt a flush crawl up my neck. My heart pounded so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. I reached for the folder. "And this," I said, "voice calm is mine." I closed the folder and tucked it under my arm. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the back door. No sobs, no shouted accusations, just a steady step across the screened porch into the late afternoon sun. Back in my small apartment, I sat on the edge of my sofa, the folder on the coffee table like a challenge. I didn't cry, I just stared. I traced the brass latch on the folder cover. My hands trembled. On the tray beside me were half-drunk glasses of tea and a plate of shortbread cookies, the ones my friend Julia had baked. Julia, 24, ran a small flower shop downtown and had been my unexpected ally since Erin and I fought over our mother's attention as kids. She'd texted me, "Don't let them gaslight you," then showed up at my door with tea and cookies. I picked up my phone. No missed calls, just one unread message from Liam. "Liam, you're out of line. Stop interfering." "Nice," I muttered. I tapped archive. Julia poked her head into the living room. "Coffee." I nodded. She poured. "So," I sighed. "She humiliated me in front of everyone." She sat. "What did you expect?" I stared at the ceiling. "Gratitude? Maybe a hug?" My voice cracked. "She hated that gift." Julia folded her hands. "They had to know you did the heavy lifting. Isn't that the point?" I blinked. "When you put it like that..." But she made it look pathetic. Julia nudged me. "Well, what's your next move?" That night, I lay awake listening to city sounds. At 3 a.m., I promised myself 3 calls. Riverside Manor venue. Cancel deposit. They'd been courteous under my name. No refund necessary. Will release the date. Étoile Bridal Boutique. Void the dress credit. The stylist Elise texted me back, "Understood. Your account is clear." My bank. Stop payment on the check. I watched each digital notification pop up like fireworks of finality. In my mind, I saw Erin's smug smile dissolve into confusion when the boutique called her at noon with, "Sorry, your order's been canceled." By sunrise, I'd burned the folder in my kitchen sink. The edges curled into ash. I felt lighter. Morning light found my phone flooded. "Mom missed calls, X4 voicemails." "Why would you do that?" "Call me Sophie. You're too harsh." "Unreal." Erin voicemails, X2 tears, rage. "Liam text, you're sabotaging everything. Stop." I didn't respond. I'd given her 3 weeks to manage her own wedding. Now it was her mess. Meanwhile, word spread fast. The venue rebooked that date for a corporate retreat. They returned Erin's photo ID with a smiling apology card. Étoile Brittle put the gown back on the rack. The planner Carlos called Erin personally. "You're behind $700,000. Let me know when you've sorted funds." By midday, the estimated total to restore Erin's plans hovered at $12,000, not including emotional fallout. My parents covered most of it, dishes clattering in the kitchen. I heard my mother say, "We can't waste this space." My father muttered, "It's not that big a deal." They didn't understand. They never did. Late afternoon, Mom called again. "You're still invited to the wedding if you want." I leaned against my doorframe. The invitation felt like a revolving door. I sighed. "Of course I'll come," I said out loud, even though she couldn't hear me. "But not to celebrate." That afternoon, I drove past the empty venue, its windows reflecting the sky. I pictured Erin pacing, Liam panicking, Carlos fuming. The wedding that once glittered in her dreams lay in ruins. I exhaled. My reflection in the windshield stared back, determined calm. I wasn't walking away. I was walking toward the moment she had to explain herself. I slipped through the side entrance of the reception hall just as the late afternoon light hit the crystal chandelier, casting fractured rainbows across the ivory tablecloths. I perched on the edge of a velvet settee near the bar, my heart thrumming in my ears like a warning drum. Everyone was absorbed in laughter and small talk, oblivious to the tremor underneath my calm. I felt the smooth leather of my clutch under my fingertips, the one I'd bought the day after the shower, as if a new purse could wipe the slate clean. I watched as Erin floated by in her gown, white as fresh paint, and felt a flint of something dangerous spark inside me. This wasn't just about a dress or a check anymore. It was about every time I'd swallowed my pride so she could shine. It was about the contract I'd signed in smiles and the deposits I'd wired under the guise of sisterly love. Today, I decided I was going to reveal the ledger of hidden burdens, whether they wanted to see it or not. I rose and let the gentle buzz of the crowd carry me to the head table, where the stock-stiff bridesmaids fanned themselves like paper flowers. I noticed the dusty mauve ribbons tied to the chairs, the same ribbons my mother had approved for Erin's color palette. They fluttered at my approach as if whispering, "This is not your place." The planning committee had hoped the ribbons would bind us in unity, but to me, they looked like bindings, tying me to expectations I'd never asked for. I cleared my throat and said, "Excuse me." Silence slapped the room harder than any insult. Faces turned. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Erin's eyes narrowed in surprise. My surprise. Leaning forward, I whispered, "I have something to share." I could feel the weight of that ribbon around my wrists tightening like a noose. The silence waited for me to speak or to break. I took a deep breath and pulled out a small matte black notebook, my personal ledger of every cent I'd spent, every favor I'd done, hidden away in neat columns. I opened it to the first page. Venue deposit, $5,000. Dress credit, $4 or $200. Planning fees, $1,800. I let my finger trace the numbers as I spoke. 3 weeks ago, I gave these amounts to cover your expenses. You laughed at me when I handed over a folder, said I was buying your happiness. My voice was a blade honed on disappointment. I watched Erin's cheeks flush pink. Liam shifted uncomfortably as if I'd exposed a draft under his tuxedo. I felt a thrill, a risk so sharp it made my teeth hurt. Tonight, I said I want everyone to know who paid for this celebration. I tapped the notebook. Tapping felt ceremonial, holy, and for a moment, I believed I was baptizing our family in truth. Whispers erupted. Some guests clutched their champagne flutes tighter, as though I'd shaken the delicate glass myself. I closed the book and held their gaze, waiting for anyone to call me out or call me brave. The planner. Carlos squeaked early like a wounded bird. "That's confidential." But I cut him off. "Nothing is confidential when it's a debt of love," I said. "When it's buried in ledgers and concealed behind smiles." I scanned the room. Aunt Marisol's camera lay abandoned on the cake table. She'd stopped filming. Even the DJ paused the Lumineers track mid-chorus, as if the music couldn't survive the truth. I felt a tight thrill in my chest, like I'd struck a match in a gasoline factory. Social norms, once so sturdy, wavered under my words. I saw my father's jaw clench, his tie a noose he refused to loosen. My mother's eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with recognition. She understood betrayal curriculum vitae style. Erin looked like she might dissolve like the ice sculptures someone had carved into hearts and lilies near the dance floor. In that heartbeat, I realized I'd risked everything to shatter the veneer of celebration, and now there was no going back. Just as tension peaked, I stepped off the stage of confrontation and made my way to a solitary window overlooking the rose garden. The sun was dipping below the hedges, painting the sky in bruised purples and gold. I pressed my palm to the cool glass, the scent of crushed petals drifting through the open sash. It was symbolic. I thought I was a sister crushed under expectation, now pressing back against the barrier. The garden path wound through shadows and light, the duality of what I'd done. I closed my eyes and let the last of my fear drain out, replaced by a steady resolve. Whatever came next, accusations, ostracism, ridicule, I was no longer tethered by unspoken debts. Behind me, muffled arguments rose like storm clouds. Ahead, the path curled into the darkening rose bushes, uncertain and wild. And in that moment, I knew my story was about to enter its most dangerous chapter 1, where the stakes were all or nothing. I climbed into my car and sat there with the engine off, the reception hall lights still shimmering through the windshield like taunting fireflies. My phone buzzed, nonstop texts from cousins I barely know, voicemails from bridesmaids begging me to apologize, a string of unread group messages that pounded my confidence into dust. I pressed the palm of my hand to the steering wheel, feeling its cool leather like a lifeline. For years, I'd been the fixer, the silent architect behind every smile in our family. Tonight, I'd blown the blueprints to rubble. As tears stung at the back of my eyes, I realized the storm I'd conjured wasn't just about money or pride, it was about the expectation that love can be bought, ledgered, and neatly repaid. Somewhere between that ledger and the mocking laughter, I'd lost myself. So I turned the key, not to escape, but to chase clarity, and drove away from the hall toward the quiet hum of an empty highway, the ghost of my anger fading into purpose. What I needed now wasn't an apology from them, but a reckoning for myself, and I knew exactly where I'd find it. The next morning, I walked into my favorite coffee shop, a little place with brick walls splashed in crimson ivy, a symbolic reminder that beauty can bloom from hardship. I ordered a black Americano and sat at the corner table where afternoon sun painted golden bars across the floor. I dug into my bag and pulled out a leather-bound journal, the one I'd started as a teenager to wrestle with family conflicts I didn't know how to voice. My pen hovered over the blank page as I thought about Aaron's laughter, my mother's soft chiding, my father's silent disappointment. Was their disapproval punishment or a plea for me to conform? I wrote a single line I refused to be collateral damage in their performance of perfection. The words felt like a scalpel cutting through a veil of doubt. Around me, strangers chatted about mundane things, mortgages, morning commutes, a coworker's wedding, unaware of how sharply life can pivot in one moment of truth. I closed the journal and looked at my reflection in the window, half obscured by ivy vines, and smiled. The vines reminded me that even when walls feel impenetrable, there's always a crack for something new to grow. And I was ready to sprout. Throughout the week, I started planting seeds of change. I drafted an email to Aaron not to apologize, but to set boundaries. No more hidden debts, no more unsolicited bailouts. I emailed our parents a request for a family meeting not to beg forgiveness, but to propose a new contract, mutual respect, clear expectations, and honest conversations. Each message felt risky, like tossing lit matches into a room full of dried tinder. I waited for the flames. Instead, I got silence. Days passed with no replies, and I felt a familiar tug of loneliness. Then, just as doubt began to gnaw at my resolve, I got a call from Julia. Her voice was calm but firm. "You did the right thing. I've been where you are, carrying everyone's burdens until I broke." She offered me her studio space for an art show she was curating, a theme she said would mirror my journey, unwritten ledgers. The twist felt improbable, my private rebellion now echoing in a public gallery. It was a risk, yes, standing with my scars in a room full of strangers, but it was the first real invitation to reclaim my narrative. I agreed, my heart racing at the thought of bearing witness to my own transformation. Opening night arrived like a challenge wrapped in fairy lights. The gallery smelled of fresh paint and possibility, and the walls were lined with pages from my journal blown up to poster size, each one a confessional, stained with coffee rings and hastily scribbled margins. Beneath them, I'd displayed symbolic objects, a rusted key to represent doors I'd locked on my own, fear a single white rose pinned to a ledger sheet to show that even debts can bear petals of forgiveness. Guests milled around, murmuring softly as they traced the words with their eyes. I stood at the center, hands clasped, feeling every story, mine and theirs, pulse through the room like a shared heartbeat. Just as I began to explain my vision, Erin appeared at the doorway, her silhouette haloed by the street lamp outside. She didn't speak. She simply stared, vulnerability cracking her usual armor of serenity. In that tense hush, I realized my fight had never been with her alone, but with the idea that love must always be transactional. And as the crowd held its breath, I extended my hand, not in truce, but in recognition. Neither apology nor accusation. Just acknowledgement that we were both strugglers under the same sky, each seeking to be seen on our own terms. The air vibrated with unspoken questions. And in that pregnant pause, I knew the next chapter was about to begin. I stood beneath the gallery's dimmed lights, heart pounding as if it had learned a new rhythm, one that no longer faltered at Erin's name. The crowd had thinned, but the echo of hushed conversations lingered like incense smoke. Erin hovered at the edge of the exhibit, her silhouette framed by a blown-up journal page splashed with coffee-stained confessions. I dropped the ledger key sculpture into my palm, its rusted teeth jagged against my skin, a reminder of every door I'd forced open at the risk of my own safety. When she stepped forward, her breath caught. "Sophie," she whispered, as if saying my name would shatter the fragile truce. I unfolded my arms, feeling the weight of my own boundaries slip like sand. "I'm listening," I said. The words tasted like both surrender and triumph. In that suspended moment, I realized that speaking truth had loosened the chains of my own fear, but had I opened the door wide enough for her to truly step through? The next afternoon, I found Erin on the bench in Rosemont Park, where dogwoods arched like arms offering solace. She sat, hunched over her phone, thumbs trembling as she drafted a message. The social contract app buzzed with overdue bills and wedding vendor reminders. I sat beside her without a word, the bench's rough timber pressed into my jeans like a silent question. She finally looked up, eyes rimmed with exhaustion that no amount of bridal glow could mask. "I lost my job," she said, voice brittle. "They found out about the wedding chargebacks. Liam left before dawn." The words fell like pebbles into my chest. Here was the sister I thought I'd freed, now crushed under real debts and empty vows. I felt my instinct flare, urge to rescue, to rebuild her broken pieces. But as I watched her, I remembered the ledger burning in my sink, the cost of my own self-erasure. Could I help her without buying her love again? A week later, in Julia's flower-scented studio, I sketched out a new collaboration, Erin's debt-to-self installation woven through my unwritten ledgers exhibit. Julia draped strands of jasmine around our plan, aromatic symbols of hope sprouting from ruin. "Let her tell her story," Julia urged, brushing a petal across my sketchbook. The idea felt like walking a tightrope above a crowd hungry for drama. What if Erin refused? What if I re-entangled myself in the family's cycles? Yet in my chest, something fierce beat back. If truth was my anchor, collaboration could be our shared sail. Erin would face her mistakes in public, reclaim her narrative, and I could support without sacrificing my hard-won autonomy. When I called her that evening, my voice was steady enough to hold both promise and risk. "Will you join me?" On opening night of our joint exhibit, the gallery pulsed with tension and possibility. Erin arrived in a simple navy dress, no custom credits, no hidden fees, her hair pulled back to reveal vulnerability unadorned. As she stood before her own piece, a series of wedding invitations shredded and reassembled into a mandala of burnt edges, I watched her inhale courage. Guests circled, murmuring about the alchemy of broken promises transformed into art. I slipped into the crowd's periphery, clutching my rusted key, now a talisman of shared liberation. Erin caught my eye, and in that gaze lay both apology and newfound strength. We didn't need words. Our art spoke the debts we'd paid, the boundaries we'd drawn, and the futures we might build. Outside, the street lamps flickered like hesitant stars. Inside, two sisters stood, one ledger closed, another just beginning, and the space between us shimmered with untold chapters yet to be written.